All right, so welcome everybody. My name is Christopher Clark. I am the Outreach and Engagement Librarian here at SUU. And I'm going to be talking to you today about information synthesis. And we're going to be talking about it and using what's called a synthesis matrix, which you'll be using in your assignment 5. So let's start by talking about what scholarship is. And scholarship really at its heart is a conversation. It's a conversation among different people that are all contributing to the ideas and knowledge going on in that conversation, and you'll be contributing to that. Research is a social process, right? So everybody is part of a community of some kind, and this includes researchers. We're all part of a community of academics and scholars. And if you imagine it like a party that you're going into and everybody's having a conversation about, say, dogs. And somebody's saying how they got a new puppy over here, and somebody else is talking about how they trained their dog when they were raising them from a puppy to adulthood, right? Everybody's kind of contributing their own knowledge set to this greater conversation. And let's imagine that you find a spot where you can then add your voice and contribute something that hasn't already been said, right? And that's basically what research is. And researchers communicate through publications, through the peer-reviewed scholarly articles that we've been having you find as for your other assignments. And these are the established ways that academics kind of exchange ideas and information. And now, as we begin to enter Assignment 5, this is your part where you're going to be entering that conversation and contributing to the scholarship. So what's your first step? The first step is what's called information synthesis, right? So we began by talking about that conversation. And as with any conversation, before you begin to contribute, you have to listen into what others are saying. And so really, finding the sources that you found in the previous few weeks is part of that listening process, right? Finding good peer-reviewed sources that you can read and pull ideas from and begin to synthesize. So you want to try and gather your sources and make connections between those sources. Identify what are the major themes and ideas, and then focusing really on the ideas and not just a summary or a quotation, but how are those ideas expressed throughout the article, throughout the paper. And then you'll start to find how themes and ideas and thoughts are expressed in different ways across different articles and across different papers. And then once you've identified those and pulled those out, you can begin to merge them. So you take these multiple sources, you analyze them, you combine them in meaningful ways, and you start to identify what these conversations are and where they're happening. And then at that point, it's time for you to use your own voice. You'll use these sources to begin to construct your paper, and that's going to help you guide your reader along the journey and showing how you came to the conclusions you did, how you're making your argument, and where it fits within this greater conversation. So let's take just a brief look at what this looks like visually. So we have student A, B, C, and D. And these are color-coded to highlight areas where portions of an article or paper have essentially been copied and pasted. So, so let's look at student D, and then we'll work our way backwards to A. So in student D, as you can see that obviously because it's all in one color and large portions of it are highlighted, they've essentially just taken from one source and copied and pasted very liberally from it to the point where there are very few words that are actually the student's own, right? And this can be very frustrating. Not only is it just a plagiarized paper because a significant portion of it is just copy and pasted, but also it's just kind of a waste of the professor's time because we could easily go find the primary source and read this information in that source, right? So it's not really contributing anything new to the conversation. And then we look at student C, and again, a significant portion is copied and pasted. Now it looks like it's from two different sources, so some are taken from, looks like 3 different sources, and that's how they're color-coded. So even though that they come from different sources, still the entirety of the paper itself, pretty much except for a few words here and there, is plagiarized. And if we move this way to student B, we start to see that less of it is copied and pasted, but it's all yellow, those portions that are highlighted. So we see that they're only pulling from one source. And it can be really difficult to begin to contribute anything meaningful to a conversation if you're only listening to one voice, right? At that point, it's just a strict dialogue between you and this one other person rather than a conversation in a group of people, right? So it's not really as helpful as what we find with student A. So with student A, you can see that there are some highlighted portions, but the majority of it is in the student's own words, and that the highlighted portions represent different colors. So there's about 5 different sources being used, within this page here. And that's exactly what a good paper should look like. That you are reading and communicating with a variety of different sources, and you're incorporating them into your paper, but you're also using your own words and using your own ideas to kind of organize the thoughts and contribute to the conversation. Okay. And a nice tool for going about doing this, especially if you're just starting out with research papers, is using what's called the synthesis matrix. And this is what it looks like, right, in its most basic form. So basically, we have up here the topic, and we'll use an example here in a moment. And then we have it broken down in columns by sources, right? So you have source 1, source 2, source 3, and source 4. And all of our sources are going to say, slightly different things or have different things to contribute to this big idea. So then if we move over here, we can see that we have it broken down by what the main ideas are. So in this basic example, we have a main idea A and a main idea B. Okay, so then what we would do with the synthesis matrix is we would look at our first source, we would identify 1 or 2 main ideas, and we'd put those in the appropriate rows, and then we would go along to each column for each of the different sources we had. We'd identify the main ideas until we have this matrix filled out. Okay, so what happens if you pull from a lot of ideas, but you don't really incorporate them well, and you don't really draw connections and bridge them well? Sometimes it can kind of look like this picture where there are a lot of trees being planted, but it's kind of stark and they stand out very, very noticeably, right? And what we're trying to do with the synthesis matrix is get you something more like this, where the different colors and shades are blended to where it feels more cohesive and whole. Okay. So this is a fuller version of the information synthesis matrix that we just showed you, and you see that we have 4 sources going along this row, and then our main ideas A through F. This one is pretty extensive, but it just kind of gives you an idea of how full these matrices can sometimes be. Okay, so let's look at an example based on some sources we found on a topic we used to kind of walk you through this and show you how your matrix might look. So in the source one that we found, we were looking at the issue of special education, and the source one said that the debate about where a student with disabilities is best served is one of the most volatile issues in special education. The controversy stems from whether full inclusion in general education classrooms or placement in a continuum of alternative settings offers a more effective learning environment. This is a particularly difficult and subjective issue with compelling arguments on both sides. So we noticed right away that we're able to, find a few different ideas that it's working with in this greater, topic of special education, right? So we're looking specifically at students with disabilities, and then we've identified that there's a controversy in the field that involves full inclusion or placement in a continuum of alternative settings, and so on, right? So we have a few things that we can work with, right? And a couple of the main ideas that we can pull from that first source is the issue of inclusion, right? And what it has to say about inclusion in source one is that it's a volatile issue. It's a contentious debate on what is the best learning environment for students, right? Another main idea that was represented in that source was the idea of alternative placement, right? And it mentioned a continuum of settings when talking about alternative placement. So those are two main ideas, and then how the first source speaks to those ideas, right? And so we just put it in the appropriate cells. Okay, so let's move on to the next source. So in source number 2, it says that in the full inclusion model, right? So we have a model. All students, regardless of an identified disability, health needs, academic ability, unique service needs, and potentially the preference of a parent or student, are educated full-time in a general education classroom in their neighborhood school. So typically general education and special education teachers work together in the same classroom, and in some cases specialists like occupational or speech therapists work within the classroom environment well, right? So again, let's look at the main ideas that we can pull from this source, right? So we're going to go to source number 2, we're going to put it in that column, right? And so speaking to the main idea of inclusion that we were looking at from the first source, source number 2 specifically lists the full inclusion model where students are part of a regular classroom, right? They're fully integrated into a regular classroom, right? Source number 2 didn't really have anything to say about alternative placement, so we're going to leave that cell blank for the moment. But what source number 2 did that the first source didn't is it gave us a new main idea to work with, right? So it talked about educators. And so we can add that as a new main idea, and we identify that source number 2 tells us that a teacher team of general ed, special ed, and speech therapists, et cetera, are the kind of educators we're talking about that might be dealing with these students with these disabilities. So with that in mind, we'll just keep moving along with source number 3. And source number 3 says that proponents of the inclusion model believe that pulling a child out of the classroom is unequal and deprives all students of valuable learning opportunities. They focus on the value of social interaction and argue that the benefits of a full inclusion classroom extend to both general and special education students, right? So again, we're going to identify what feels most important within that source. And that deals with the main idea of inclusion, right? And it's giving a pro-argument that treating students equally and that there are social benefits involved with having them included within a general classroom, okay? And then we'll move on to source 4. And source 4 says alternative placements call for more emphasis to be placed on differentiation on a child-by-child basis. This model has 6 generally recognized placements, right? So again, remember that alternative placement was, one main idea that we'd identified from one of our sources. So this is something that's going to be important to us in looking at that particular area, right? So alternative placement is where we're going to put from source 4 the 6 placement types, which range from general classroom to special education school, homeschool, and residential program. But it also brings up, importantly, the idea of differentiation, right? And this is something that hasn't really come up in our other sources, but we're identifying it as important. And it says that figuring out education on a child-by-child basis is a good way to go about this process of differentiation, right? So you'll notice that the matrix is here to basically serve the main ideas. It's not always going to be entirely complete the first go-around, right? Or even in the second go-around. There are going to be blank areas. Some sources are going to speak to certain main ideas that other sources don't, and vice versa. So just being very careful to really look at the main ideas and the main threads that are occurring across sources, and also that are occurring in certain sources and not in others. Okay. And so we'll look at the connections, right? So each row in that matrix could represent a paragraph in your paper, hypothetically. And sometimes, as we just mentioned, there are going to be a lot of blank areas. that might be a good indication that there's room for more research. So you might look up, more articles or more research to help fill in those areas. And sometimes you'll just have too much stuff in a row. And if there's too much in a single row, then that's usually an indication that you want to kind of break it into subcategories, right? And so that way, that's going to give you kind of more of a branch that you can deal with. Okay. So congratulations, you filled out the synthesis matrix, and you've got your main ideas, you've got everything filled out, and you're beginning to kind of see the patterns that are moving across them. So now what? Now it's time to really look at the matrix, right? So if your ideas are covered in a single source only, it's time to probably find more information or drop that and then look at something else. And then you can, but if you're getting from a variety of sources and they're all kind of speaking to each other in these different ways, like the example we showed, then this is a point where you can begin to outline your paper. And you can determine the logical order of ideas, and you will start to see if there are gaps missing, right? So the outline will be an area where you can find what the main ideas are and what order they should be presented in to make logical sense. And one way that might be helpful to think of this is imagine that you're creating a playlist, right? And so you have different songs. You want them to kind of all speak to each other in a certain way and move along in a certain kind of linear fashion that speaks to the overall argument or theme you're working with. And then you'll begin to write each paragraph. And again, you can use the rows in the matrix to kind of help you identify what those paragraphs could be. Where you could introduce the idea and you could use the different information that you've gleaned from your sources to speak about in that paragraph. Be sure to add your own voice. Don't make it just a compilation of these sources. Really be using your voice to talk about the ideas in those sources and how they work with each other or against each other. And then make connections using transition words. So here are some examples of transition words and kind of what they do. So if you're wanting to add to an idea, right, so you've introduced an idea and you want to add to it, you can use transition words like furthermore, moreover, in addition. Or if you're just introducing information for the first time, you can say things like for example or for instance, including, and so on. If you're trying to compare and contrast two different sources, right? So let's say we were wanting to look at two sources that had differing viewpoints about the full inclusion model. So we might say, conversely, or to highlight that there's a difference between two different sources. Or if you just wanted to talk about how two sources kind of dovetail and speak to the same idea, you can say similarly or in the same way, and so on. And sometimes you want to make a concession in your paper, right? So sometimes there are gaps in arguments or incomplete areas, and you can use words like nevertheless or despite this to kind of address those and acknowledge that you've done the research and are acknowledging those gaps and introducing them in your paper. And we'll look just at this section here to give you an example of what that looks like in practice. So this is a paragraph taken from a source about information synthesis. So it says, information synthesis is a key skill for participants in our knowledge society and requires complex processing, right? And they're getting that from these sources, Fitzgerald 2004, Goldman 2004. Yet, information literacy, instruction, and practice tend to favor easily defined skills that often only emphasize the search component of the research process, leaving out higher order processes like information synthesis, right? So in the first line, we're introducing the idea of information synthesis, identifying it as a key skill according to this source, and we're saying yet. So we're trying to say that, despite the fact that it's identified as a key skill, information literacy, instruction, and practice tend to favor other easily defined skills. And that's taken from these other sources. And then we build on that by saying, similarly, in the writing classroom, teachers are largely unfamiliar with how to teach synthesis, sometimes implying it is a linear process, right? So this is a source that is piggybacking off of this source and kind of augmenting and like, adding to it. So that's why we're adding the similarly as a word to kind of combine those. Comma, leading Mateos and Sol to call for a, quote, unique, careful teaching approach, right? So notice that in here we're using several different sources in the course of a single paragraph, and there's only 4 words that are directly quoted, right? So all of this is using the author's own language to pull from these ideas and arrange them in such a way that they're building on each other to make an argument for information synthesis, as an important skill that needs to be, more deeply entrenched in the classroom. Okay, so knowing what we know now, you're going to take these skills, and for the Module 5 assignment, you're going to create your own synthesis matrix, and this is going to tie in with your assignment for English 2010, where you're going to use it to begin to map out your paper, use it to write those paragraphs, and build an outline. Okay, so remember that we're always here to answer questions. I am a librarian, but so are all of my colleagues who teach this course, and they can answer your questions about the synthesis matrix just as well as I can. So please reach out to us, use the office hours on your syllabus and the contact info, or reach out to a librarian on the questions desk. And thank you so much for joining us. Thanks.